Have you ever noticed how someone can stop talking and somehow it feels like they are saying the loudest thing you've ever heard? Not words, not arguments, not explanations, just silence. And yet, that silence can sit in your chest heavier than any insult ever could. Most people misunderstand silence. They think it is nothing. They think if no words are coming out, then nothing is happening. But human psychology does not work that way. The mind never accepts emptiness. It fills every gap, every pause, every silence. And what it fills it with is not always truth. Most of the time, it is fear. This is where the real story begins. Because silence is never just silence. It becomes a message without a sentence, a feeling without explanation. And the dangerous part is that it forces the other person to interpret it on their own. And when humans are forced to interpret without clarity, they rarely assume the best. They assume what hurts the most. You might think staying silent is neutral, safe, harmless. But in reality, silence is active. It is doing something. It is shaping emotions in the mind of the other person. Slowly, quietly, without permission. And that is why silence can hurt more than words ever could. Think about it deeply. When someone cares about you, when there is emotional attachment, there is also expectation. Not always spoken, but silently understood. A reply, a response, a sign of presence. And when that sign suddenly disappears, the brain does not say, maybe they are busy. That is the logical answer. But emotion is not logical. Emotion says something else. Emotion says something is wrong. Emotion says, did I do something? Emotion says, am I not important anymore? This is how silence starts building stories inside someone's mind. Stories that were never real, but feel completely real to them. And the more time passes, the stronger those stories become. Because unanswered silence is like fuel for overthinking. It keeps burning without stopping. Human beings are wired for connection. We are not designed for emotional uncertainty. When communication is clear, even bad news feels easier to accept than unclear silence. Because clarity gives closure. Silence gives imagination. And imagination without control always creates suffering. This is why silence is not empty. It is full of assumptions, full of doubt, full of emotional interpretation. And the most painful part is that the person on the receiving end starts to change. Not immediately, but slowly. First, they start checking their phone more often, then they start replaying past conversations, then they start questioning their value in your life. And without realizing it, their peace starts breaking piece by piece, all because of silence. You may not even notice it happening. From your side, it feels like nothing, just distance, just space. But from their side, it feels like emotional abandonment. And that difference in perception is where most emotional damage begins. Here is something most people never think about. Silence removes certainty, and when certainty disappears, the brain creates worst-case scenarios to protect itself. It is a survival mechanism. The mind believes that preparing for pain is safer than hoping for comfort, so it imagines rejection before it even happens. It imagines loss before it becomes real. It imagines ending before there is even an explanation. And all of that starts from one thing: silence. Now here is the deeper truth. The most painful silence is not from strangers. It is from people who once meant something. Because emotional memory does not reset easily. The mind remembers warmth. It remembers connection. And when that connection suddenly becomes silence, the contrast feels like emotional shock. That is why silence hurts more than argument. At least in an argument, there is still presence. There is still engagement. There is still proof that the relationship exists. But silence feels like disappearance while still being physically there. That contradiction confuses the brain. And confusion is one of the strongest sources of emotional pain. If you stay with this message till the end, you will understand something very powerful about human behavior. You will see how silence silently shapes relationships, how it changes perception without a single word, and how small communication gaps slowly turn into emotional distance that people never planned for. Because the truth is simple, but not easy to accept. What you do not say often becomes louder than what you do say. And sometimes what you think is peace is actually hurting someone more than you can imagine. And this is only the beginning. When silence enters a relationship, why does the mind suddenly become so loud? Because the human brain is not built to handle gaps in emotional information. It is designed to seek meaning in everything. When something is missing, it does not stay neutral. It immediately starts building explanations. And most of those explanations are emotional, not logical. This is where silence becomes dangerous without anyone realizing it. The moment communication stops, the mind begins a process called filling the void. It takes whatever emotional memories are available and starts connecting them into a story. But here is the problem. The brain does not choose the most accurate story. It chooses the most emotionally intense one, the one that feels urgent, the one that feels threatening. That is why silence never stays empty. It becomes a space where fear grows quietly. At first, the person on the receiving end tries to stay calm. They tell themselves it is probably nothing serious. But deep down, uncertainty has already started its work. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, and when people feel uncomfortable for too long, they start searching for reasons, even random ones, even harmful ones. Slowly, attention shifts, normal focus decreases. Emotional focus increases. Every small detail becomes important. Every delay feels meaningful. Every unanswered moment starts to feel like a signal. And this is how overthinking begins without permission. Overthinking does not start with drama. It starts with silence. At this stage, the mind starts revisiting past interactions, not because they are relevant, but because they are available. Memory becomes evidence. Even harmless moments are reinterpreted under a new emotional lens. A simple sentence spoken earlier suddenly feels different. A small change in tone becomes suspicious. A delay that was once ignored now feels intentional. The brain is not trying to be dramatic. It is trying to protect emotional stability. But in doing so, it creates instability. This is the silent cycle most people do not recognize. The more silence continues, the more emotional tension increases. And the more emotional tension increases, the more the mind tries to explain it. But explanations are never satisfying because they are built on assumptions, not clarity. So the cycle repeats. Each loop makes the feeling stronger than before. One of the most overlooked effects of silence is emotional self-questioning. The person starts turning inward. Instead of asking what happened outside, they start asking what is wrong within themselves. They begin to measure their worth through absence. They start linking their value to response. If there is no response, they assume there is no importance. This shift is subtle but powerful. It changes confidence. It changes behavior. It changes emotional stability. And most importantly, it changes how someone sees themselves in relation to others. At this point, silence is no longer just lack of communication. It becomes a silent judgment in the mind of the other person, even if no judgment was ever intended. Another hidden effect is emotional waiting. Waiting is not passive. It is active stress. The mind stays alert, expecting something to happen. Every notification, every sound, every small interruption becomes emotionally charged. This constant state of alertness drains mental energy without showing visible signs. People often mistake this phase as patience, but it is actually emotional fatigue building quietly. As time passes, the expectation of response starts to weaken, not because the need disappears, but because the mind begins to adjust to disappointment. This is where emotional withdrawal begins. The person slowly starts reducing their hope, not because they want to, but because repeated uncertainty forces adaptation. And adaptation in this case means emotional detachment. The most painful part is that detachment does not happen loudly. It happens quietly, first through reduced attention, then through reduced emotional investment, then through acceptance of distance, until eventually the absence of communication no longer feels temporary. It starts feeling normal. This is how emotional separation forms without any clear ending. What makes silence even more complex is that both sides often believe they are protecting themselves. One side believes staying quiet avoids conflict. The other side believes waiting is respect. But neither side realizes that emotional distance is growing in the background. And when distance becomes familiar, connection becomes harder to rebuild. There is also a psychological shift that happens in perception of importance. When communication is consistent, emotional priority feels stable. But when communication becomes inconsistent or absent, importance starts feeling uncertain. The mind does not like uncertain importance. It starts to downgrade expectations to reduce emotional risk. That downgrade is subtle but irreversible if it continues for too long. Eventually, the emotional connection is no longer based on closeness. It becomes based on absence. And absence is never a strong foundation. The most critical misunderstanding is assuming silence is neutral space. It is not. It is active emotional construction happening inside the mind of the other person. Even without words, meaning is being formed. Even without intention, interpretation is happening. And interpretation, once formed, becomes emotionally real. This is why silence has consequences far beyond what is visible. By the time communication is restored, the emotional state is often no longer the same. The mind has already adapted. The emotional story has already been written. And reversing that story requires more than just returning. It requires rebuilding what silence slowly reshaped. And this is what most people realize too late. At some point, silence stops being confusion and starts becoming belief. This is where something very important happens inside the human mind. When information is missing for too long, the brain does not stay in a questioning state forever. It eventually settles on an answer. Not because it is correct, but because the mind prefers certainty over uncertainty. Even painful certainty feels easier than emotional confusion. So the story changes shape inside the person experiencing silence. What once felt like waiting slowly turns into meaning. And that meaning is rarely positive. The mind begins to accept a version of reality where absence equals rejection, not because it was told directly, but because repetition of emptiness created that conclusion over time. And once a belief forms emotionally, it becomes difficult to challenge with logic. At this stage, behavior starts to shift. The person no longer reacts with curiosity, they start reacting with emotional protection, their energy changes, their responses change, even their tone becomes different. Not because feelings disappeared, but because self-respect begins to activate as a defense mechanism. When someone feels emotionally ignored for long enough, they stop reaching out with openness. Instead, they start observing from distance. They begin to test where they stand without directly asking. This creates silent emotional tension that both sides can feel, even without words being exchanged. But the most important change is internal. The mind starts building emotional boundaries, not physical ones, but mental ones. It begins deciding what level of care is safe. It begins limiting expectation to reduce disappointment. This is not a conscious choice. It is a survival response. The heart learns to expect less in order to hurt less. And this shift slowly changes the entire connection dynamic. What was once emotional closeness starts becoming cautious interaction. Every action is now filtered through the lens of past absence. Even small gestures are no longer received with the same warmth, because trust in consistency has weakened. At the same time, the person who initiated silence often does not see these changes immediately. From their perspective, nothing major seems different. But from the other side, emotional structure has already started reorganizing itself. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of human relationships. Damage does not always look like breaking. Sometimes it looks like quiet adjustment, a slow reduction of emotional availability, a gradual lowering of attachment, until the connection feels different without any visible conflict. And once emotional distance is normalized, returning to previous closeness is no longer automatic. There is also another psychological layer that develops during prolonged silence. The mind begins creating self-protection narratives. These are internal explanations that help reduce emotional pain. Instead of asking, why is this happening? The brain starts telling itself, this is what I expected, or this is how things always end. These narratives are not facts. They are coping tools. But once they settle, they influence future behavior. The person becomes less expressive, less open, less willing to invest emotionally without certainty. They may still care, but their expression of care becomes controlled and guarded. This is emotional conditioning happening silently over time. Another important change is emotional independence forming in an unintended way. The person starts relying less on external validation, not because they have become stronger in a positive sense, but because they have learned not to expect emotional consistency. This creates a shift where they start building comfort within themselves instead of depending on interaction. On the surface, this may look like growth, but internally, it is often adaptation to emotional inconsistency, and adaptation always changes connection patterns. One of the most powerful effects of silence is how it reshapes memory. Human memory is not static. It rewrites emotional meaning based on current feelings. When someone feels disconnected, past moments are no longer remembered with the same warmth. Even good experiences lose emotional weight because the present feeling overrides them. This is why distance does not just affect the present, it also alters the past. As this continues, emotional investment becomes harder to recover, not because affection disappears, but because the mind becomes trained to expect uncertainty. And once expectation shifts, reaction changes permanently. The same attention that once felt meaningful no longer creates the same impact. This is where many connections struggle to return to their original state. Another subtle effect is emotional comparison. The mind begins comparing present silence with past engagement, and every comparison highlights absence more than presence. This increases emotional discomfort and reduces patience. Over time, tolerance decreases, even for situations that would have been easily accepted before. At this point, silence is no longer just lack of communication. It becomes a pattern that influences identity within the relationship. The person experiencing it starts to redefine their role. They may stop initiating, they may stop expressing openly, not because they stopped caring, but because they are trying to protect emotional balance. This creates a silent gap where both sides feel distance, but neither fully addresses it. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reverse naturally. What makes this stage so critical is that emotional change is no longer reversible through small actions. Because the mind has already built structure around absence, it now expects less engagement as normal. Any attempt to suddenly restore closeness may feel unfamiliar rather than comforting. This is how silence slowly rewrites emotional expectations without direct confrontation. And once expectations change, behavior follows automatically. When emotional distance becomes familiar, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside the human mind. The brain stops reacting with urgency and starts reacting with acceptance. Not because the situation feels right, but because repetition has trained it to normalize absence. This is one of the strongest psychological patterns in human behavior. What repeats often enough eventually feels acceptable, even if it was once painful. At this stage, silence is no longer experienced as a sudden event. It becomes part of the emotional environment. And once something becomes an environment, it is no longer questioned the same way. The person who once waited with hope begins to adjust their internal expectations. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, invisible steps. They stop checking as often. They stop analyzing every moment. They stop building emotional energy around response. This is not because they stopped caring instantly, but because emotional effort without return starts to feel unsustainable. Human psychology naturally avoids repeated emotional loss, so the mind reduces exposure to what causes discomfort. This reduction is not a decision, it is an automatic protection process. As this continues, a quiet transformation takes place. The emotional center that once reacted strongly begins to calm down. But this calmness is not peace, it is resignation. And resignation often looks like strength from the outside, but internally it carries a different feeling. It carries emotional exhaustion that no longer expresses itself loudly. The interesting part is how identity starts to shift during this phase. The person begins to see themselves differently within the connection. Instead of seeing themselves as someone engaged in mutual presence, they begin to see themselves as someone waiting for consistency that never arrives. This identity shift changes how they behave in every interaction. They become more reserved, more selective with expression, more careful with emotional investment, because experience has taught them that openness without stability leads to disappointment. Another important change happens in attention patterns. The mind stops prioritizing emotional signals that once felt significant. Messages, responses, timing, tone, all of these gradually lose their intensity. Not because they are unimportant, but because emotional sensitivity has been reduced through repetition of uncertainty. This is how emotional conditioning works. The brain adapts to protect itself from continued stress. At the same time, internal dialogue becomes more controlled. Instead of expecting clarity, the person starts preparing for ambiguity. Instead of hoping for consistency, they start planning emotional distance in advance. This shift creates a psychological buffer, a space between feeling and reaction. And while this buffer reduces pain, it also reduces emotional connection, because deep connection requires openness, and openness becomes limited when protection is active. There is also a silent shift in emotional memory. The mind begins to categorize experiences differently. Moments that once felt meaningful are now stored with less emotional intensity. They are not erased, but their emotional charge weakens over time. This changes how the past is felt in the present. When emotional memory weakens, attachment weakens with it. Another layer of change appears in communication instinct. The natural urge to reach out begins to fade. Not because connection is no longer desired, but because repeated uncertainty teaches the mind that reaching out does not guarantee emotional reward. And when behavior is not rewarded consistently, the brain slowly reduces its frequency. This is how emotional withdrawal forms without conscious intention. What makes this stage complex is that both sides may still assume connection exists in the same form, but internally, one side has already moved into a different emotional state. The external interaction may continue, but the internal experience is no longer aligned. This mismatch creates invisible distance that words cannot easily fix. Another psychological effect is emotional simplification. The mind begins to reduce emotional complexity in order to maintain stability. Instead of processing deep layers of feeling, it shifts towards simpler interpretations. Less questioning, less emotional analysis, more acceptance of surface-level interaction. This simplification protects mental energy, but also reduces depth of connection. Over time, emotional responses become more predictable and less intense, not because feelings disappeared completely, but because emotional investment has been redistributed inward. The person starts relying more on internal stability rather than external reassurance. This is often mistaken as personal growth from the outside, but internally it is adaptation to inconsistency. One of the most powerful effects at this stage is emotional detachment becoming natural. What once required effort now happens automatically. The mind no longer pushes for clarity as strongly as before. It no longer reacts strongly to absence. It no longer builds emotional expectation around timing. This does not happen suddenly. It happens through repeated emotional conditioning that slowly reshapes response patterns. As this continues, the relationship dynamic changes without any clear announcement. There is no moment of ending, no single event that marks the shift. Instead, there is a gradual fading of emotional intensity until what once felt important no longer carries the same weight, and this is where silence completes its deepest transformation, not as a moment of absence, but as a process that reshapes perception, expectation, and emotional behavior from within. By this point, returning to earlier emotional closeness requires more than presence. It requires rebuilding what the mind has already adjusted to live without. At this point, something very important becomes clear about human behavior. People do not react only to actions, they react to patterns. When a pattern of emotional absence continues long enough, the mind stops treating it as temporary. It becomes the new reference point. And once a new reference point is formed, everything else is measured against it. This is why rebuilding connection after prolonged distance is not as simple as returning and speaking again. The internal system has already adjusted. Emotional expectations have already shifted. The brain has already rewritten what feels normal. And normal is a powerful force in psychology. When silence becomes familiar, emotional sensitivity decreases. Not because the person stops feeling, but because the intensity of reaction gets reduced to maintain balance. The nervous system cannot stay in high alert forever, so it learns to stabilize itself by lowering emotional spikes. This stabilization comes at a cost. The cost is reduced emotional responsiveness. What once triggered excitement or urgency now creates mild acknowledgement instead. The emotional system no longer amplifies signals the same way. This is not rejection, it is adaptation. The mind is simply trying to avoid returning to a state of uncertainty it has already experienced. Another shift that occurs is emotional prioritization. The brain begins reorganizing what deserves attention. Inconsistent emotional input gets placed lower in priority. Stable internal thoughts and personal focus begin to take higher importance. This is how emotional focus slowly moves inward. The person is still capable of feeling connection, but the pathway to express it becomes less automatic. Instead of reacting instantly, they pause internally. They evaluate. They filter. And sometimes they choose not to respond emotionally at all, even if feeling exists underneath. This filtering process is a protective mechanism. It helps maintain control in situations where emotional outcomes feel unpredictable. As this continues, the concept of emotional safety becomes central. People naturally seek environments where their feelings are respected and predictable. When communication history includes repeated uncertainty, the brain starts associating that connection with emotional risk. Once something is labeled as risky, hesitation increases, and hesitation is the beginning of emotional distance. Another important change happens in internal narrative structure. The mind begins to reduce emotional dependency on external validation. It starts building self-contained reasoning systems. Instead of waiting for emotional confirmation, the person begins forming their own interpretations and conclusions internally. This internal independence reduces emotional vulnerability, but it also reduces openness, because openness requires trust, and trust weakens when consistency is missing. Over time, emotional expression becomes more controlled, not because feelings disappear, but because expression is no longer automatic. The person becomes selective about where they invest emotional energy. They begin to value emotional return more consciously. This selectiveness changes interaction quality. Simple exchanges that once carried emotional warmth now feel neutral. Not negative, just emotionally reduced. The connection is still present in structure, but not in depth, and depth is what creates emotional fulfillment. Another subtle effect is memory filtering. The mind stops replaying emotional experiences with the same frequency. Instead, it begins prioritizing present stability over past attachment. This shift reduces emotional longing and increases present awareness. When present awareness dominates, emotional pull from the past weakens. This is how attachment slowly fades without dramatic break. At this stage, even attempts to reconnect face a different psychological environment. The emotional system receiving the interaction is no longer the same system that originally formed the bond. It has been reshaped by time, repetition, and adaptation. So even positive communication may not produce the same emotional impact as before. There is also a shift in emotional interpretation speed. Earlier, signals were processed quickly and emotionally amplified. Now processing becomes slower and more analytical. The mind evaluates before responding. It weighs emotional cost against emotional value. This creates a natural delay in emotional engagement. Another key transformation is reduced emotional dependency loops. In earlier stages, emotional uncertainty often created a cycle of anticipation and disappointment. But now, that cycle weakens. The mind no longer invests heavily in uncertain outcomes. Instead, it conserves emotional energy. This conservation becomes a habit, and habits shape long-term behavior more than feelings do. As these patterns settle, the emotional identity of the person changes again. They no longer define themselves through expectation of consistent response. Instead, they define themselves through internal stability. This shift reduces emotional volatility, but also reduces relational intensity. Because strong emotional bonds require shared emotional investment from both sides. At this point, silence has already done its work. Not as a single action, but as a gradual reshaping force. It has influenced interpretation, altered expectation, and restructured emotional response patterns over time. And what makes this process powerful is that it does not feel like change while it is happening. It only becomes visible in hindsight. When people look back, they realize that connection did not end in one moment. It ended in small adjustments that were never noticed individually. Each adjustment seemed minor, but together they created a completely different emotional reality. And once that reality is established, returning to what once existed requires more than intention. It requires rebuilding the emotional framework that silence has already rewritten.